Hello everyone and welcome to the IFST Spring Conference webinar series, The Appliance of Food Science. My name is Helen Munday. I am President of the Institute of Food Science and Technology. Throughout this series, we will be showcasing the very best in food science and, in particular, its application through the very latest in technologies. We will be celebrating the hugely positive contribution food science and technology makes in ensuring the food sector continues to deliver. These presentations were originally part of the programme for our spring conference, which has had to be cancelled due to the current COVID-19 crisis situation. We are very pleased to be able to still bring you these presentations via webinar every Wednesday throughout April into May. I would like to thank the Food and Drink Federation for kindly sponsoring this series of webinars. We would also like to thank our corporate sponsors, Marks & Spencer, Nutraceuticals Group, IFST and Camden BRI, who provide sponsorship throughout the year, which helps IFST to deliver many of its charitable activities. With that, I hand over to Natasha Medhurst, IFST's Scientific Affairs Manager.
Thank you, Helen. Our speaker today is Ian Noble, Senior Research, Development and Quality Director at Mondelez International. As well as leading their chocolate technology group, he's also site leader for the Global Technical Centre. Ian is committed to strengthening the UK food systems technical agenda to enable growth and greater productivity and sustainability in the vital sector that we operate in, and chairs the UK Food Sector Knowledge Transfer Network, KTN. For more information on his biography, please look on our website. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Natasha. Good morning, everyone. What I'd like to take some time talking through and sharing with you this morning are some thoughts around reformulation. And for my mind, why less isn't really less. Because I think when we think of reformulation, we think classically of ingredients. And there's a lot more to reformulation. It isn't simply a question of how we use less of a given ingredient. Products don't work on that basis. And so let's start and have a look. Beginning in a straightforward way with ingredient functionality. Some of the topics we're looking at from a reformulation point of view across as an industry. Can we reduce salt? Can we reduce sugars? How do we bring fats down? And clearly, in the food context, it's fundamental to remember that many of our ingredients, including these types of ingredients here, are highly functional. And they affect both how a product is made, how the ingredients come together, how the actual product experience, and that leads through to the liking and the enjoyment from consumers, and that's us and all of us, for the foods that we eat and the foods that we enjoy. Even simple ingredients, some people might say, oh, just take the salt out of it. Well, if I look at salt in bread, it has quite a complex role interacting and it has a role interacting within the gluten structure, bringing strength into the dough, changing how the actual ferment takes place. If you're running a fermentation in there with yeasts, the interactions there are very clear. So it's much more complex than just simply a little bit less. If you look at sugars, very complex roles that they play in terms of mouthfeel. Clearly in some products they're actually playing a preservation role through the water activity and their ability to structure within products and to perform that role as well within creating network structures within products. And then even looking at fats and the simple example here of the croissant. The reason that works is because we've got hard fats that are able to create lamination within a dough, which enables us to cook out and creates that product. So there's so many functionalities that are critical to creating the products. And if we were to take out and for example, take a hard fat out of making a croissant, take butter out, for example, and just replace it with a liquid oil, you're not really going to get the same product because the materials don't work and function and transform in the same way through the process. So that's just a little peek into ingredient functionality that we have to have in our minds. But reformulation itself is fundamentally more than about just the ingredients line. And beyond even the product, it really needs to consider the whole consumer experience. So let's just take a moment and just think, well, what do we really mean? So for any reformulation to be successful, it's only successful if consumers themselves appreciate the product and are prepared to buy it. Because if it's not, then the reformulation will fail to achieve any of its goals. And as such, I think it's really clear that we need to go beyond just thinking about the product and how do you get the engagement with the consumer working, because it's a complex decision that people make, and in some cases before they've even stepped into a shop. And one of the frameworks that I find quite useful in here is a framework which I saw some time ago being talked about from Procter & Gamble, and it was talking about the moments of truth framework. And in that there's 3 moments of truth which for me work in the consumer space. And the first moment of truth is at the first time a consumer meets the product. And that traditionally has been in an in-store environment, but increasingly perhaps also is now also online as well. So what's the consumer experience? What do they see? What are their expectations? Are they engaged? Are they intrigued? Do they think it's a possibility for them? Then you move into that second moment of truth when consumer actually buys the product and eats, drinks it, consumes the product. And that's, I think for many of us, it's really where we classically see ensuring that the reformulation was a success. But the first moment's really important as well, because if we haven't got the first moment right, through the packaging, through the communication, through the engagement, then you won't even get to the second moment when someone chooses to eat the product. And then the third moment is equally key, because for the third moment of truth, it's that having enjoyed the product, the consumer then chooses to effectively become an advocate for the product. Oh, I've tried that, it was great, lovely product, really good. So the whole piece needs to come together. And so it really does tie the whole experience from end to end. Before they've met the product, they're then choosing to take it off the shelf, they're choosing to buy it, they're choosing to eat it, they're enjoying it, and then they're in a position to become an advocate. And that's really important. To get that right is essential to ensure that a lot of the technical work that sits behind it actually lands and resonates with consumers and ultimately makes it a success. And looking at the eyes of the consumer kind of also opens up the different ways of working through reformulation from a different strategy perspective. Do you choose to reformulate just on the product that people know and consume today, or do you choose a different strategy? I think this is a very nice example from my mind in terms of an iconic product, Coca-Cola, and then a product which has grown to become iconic, which is Diet Coke, where if you look at it from a consumer moments lens, really trying to understand, well, what's it about? Which are the consumers we're trying to reach? Which products are we going after? And how do we do that? How do we bring that into the space for that consumer, for that target audience? And I think they did it highly successfully, because Coca-Cola themselves know only too well what happens if you make a reformulation or a change on your core product. And thinking back some years ago now, they had a look at a product called New Coke. It was a massive undertaking, a huge piece of work that they did. And it didn't land in the way that they would have wanted it to. And so they had to ultimately reverse out of that to some degree. But the opportunity for the Diet Coke piece around the reformulation went very well, highly successful, very differentiated proposition, differentiated advertising, differentiated target audience, landed it really well. And it is a fundamentally different product. We all know if we put these two products side by side, we can tell the difference. The mouthfeel is different, the flavours and tastes are slightly different. But from a reformulation point of view, highly effective, highly successful, and a really, really good job. But it wasn't trying to be exactly the same. It was standing on its own feet, it was independent, and it was clear about what it was about and who it was for. And in a sense, that talks to one of the challenges that we have here, because if we look at why reformulation itself, if you were to try and just reformulate the iconic core product, as to why that can be so challenging. And that really comes back to us as humans. Essentially, this is what we're designing for. We've evolved to notice change, to notice when things are different, to determine whether something is what we want to eat and what we're expecting to eat. And as a part of that, we use the sensory cues. What does it look like? does it smell like? What texture does it have? How does it taste? How do those elements come together? Do I get sound when I'm enjoying the product? Do I get a sense of satiation? I include satiation here as a sensory cue. I think there's always a debate with satiation as quite where it sits, but for argument's sake, let's leave it here. So those elements are things that I need to be reassuring consumers about, because if I don't, then immediately I'm queuing up there's a difference. And if I look at the other side, if I think of it as a kind of from a system capability point of view, we have a phenomenal set of senses and what we can do. So very simply, volatile detection. For some materials, we're down at less than 1 ppb. We're able to detect. From a mouth point of view, the tongue and the way in which it moves around in the mouth, we've got a mixer there, which is actually taking foods and drinks or beverages, combining them up in the case of forming a bolus, and that has effectively a mixer capability, you could say, of about 1,000 pascal seconds. So there are different elements in here. Within the mouth, we can feel different particle sizes. In the range of 10 to 100 microns, we can feel those differences in our mouths. At the high end, it will start to feel grainy or hard. At the lower end, it might feel creamy. Depending on just changing particle size can change the way in which a product itself feels. So if you think all the way back to the formulation and the ingredient functionality that we were talking to earlier, this is really important, because if inadvertently, by changing the balance of the ingredients, by introducing a new material, we change some of the microstructures, we change some of the particle sizes within the product, we will pick that up, okay, and we'll feel that. And if you think a little bit more further into the actual specific sensors, sodium, clearly we have a need, a biological need for sodium, so our sensor threshold is pretty high in a way, perhaps let's put it high, because we need it, and so the body is looking for it, but at the same time it's not a dangerous material for us. Whereas if I look at, for example, strychnine, you see it's got a much lower threshold, because the body, we do not want to eat much strychnine, obviously, and so what we're looking to do here is, as humans, we're looking to find that, identify it, and not eat it. So that's why we have different levels of sensing, and that again impacts on where you can make changes and where the changes are harder. And then ultimately, of course, whatever reformulation we do, it has to land end to end. So we have to be able to enjoy it all the way through our bodies, and that means it also needs to sit well with our microbiome. And potentially the microbiome, obviously it's highly complex, and some of the figures that I've seen quoted historically, 3 to 10 times more cells within the microbiome than potentially there are within our body. So you've got a very complicated mixed fermentation system sitting post the stomach. What does that look like? How does that all come together? And again, how do you land a reformulation or a product change into that? Is another aspect to think about and to consider. And so we take all those things into consideration. This brings us to kind of the requirement for multiple product criteria that we need to consider. And I've taken here the example from the recent 30% less sugar product that we've done with Cadbury Dairy Milk. I thought I'd talk through some of the thinking we've done around that and some of the challenges that came with that. As with all criteria, we have, you take a look at what you've got to do, you take a look at the job in front of you and work out, okay, so what are we going to do? How are we going to make this work whilst delivering the quality expectations that the consumer has, ensuring that we can actually source the alternative ingredients we need to do the job we've got to do, that it's going to perform in the mouth in the right way, both from a textural point of view and a taste point of view. Digestibility, as I mentioned earlier about the microbiome, really key. It's one of the options within this particular product category is to think about using some of the sugar alcohols. But they bring with them challenges. For some people, they bring with them digestibility challenges, so it's not really an option. Additionally, it's worth remembering, and this is true for chocolate, may or may not be true to greater or lesser extent for other product categories, but it's to also understand what are the legal requirements that sit behind a given product, either compositionally or in the case of chocolate, there's a statement of identity which requires and specifies what can be in and what cannot be included and some of the levels therein. And ultimately, once you've got through all of that and you've worked out how the thing works, it needs to be actually be able to be made, and it needs to be manufacturable, and it needs to be manufacturable at the scale of the existing products. Otherwise, you're going to end up with an economically disadvantaged solution, which probably isn't going to be successful necessarily in the marketplace in the same way, particularly for some of the bigger, more iconic brands. In the first instance, let's thinking about sugar reduction, a very simple way to ask the question is, well, do we have anything in the portfolio today which does the job? Do we need to invent something? Do we need to discover something new? For example, if I was to take the Green and Black's Velvet product, the dark chocolate 70% cocoa, that's about a 50% sugar reduction versus existing Cadbury dairy milk. But at the same time, it's a fundamentally different product. But does that work? Does that not work? Well, clearly for some people it works, but for those people, many of them the core Cadbury dairy milk users, clearly that's not a one-for-one substitution. So in this instance, we needed to go back and ask ourselves, okay, how are we going to actually do this? How do we get to a reduced sugar option for people? And how do we make that one work? If you focus on the image on the left-hand side, in a sense, this is the job to be done. This is a micrograph, it's a confocal image of chocolate. And it shows green is the fat that's in the product, the sugar are the small black crystals which are present, the proteins are in red, and the cocoa solids themselves are in blue. Now clearly, if we want to reduce the sugar here, we want to take out, so let's say 30% of the sugar, I need to work out what I'm going to replace that sugar with. Because there's a physical dimension within a solid food structure. That means that on a per gram basis, if I take something out, I have to put something back in. So there's a need for physical replacement, particularly in this situation. Within a beverage environment, it's different. It's a different challenge because I can always replace with water, but then I have to work out how do I rebuild the mouthfeel, how do I rebuild the sensory delivery across the whole piece, including the flavours and aromas and volatiles. How does that all come together? Whereas in the food structure, I don't have the ability to simply drop in an inert, flavourless material to bulk. So there's a physical need to replacement. Additionally, as we're working through the replacement and which ingredients you can look at to achieve the same performance, or close to the same performance, you need to think about the dynamics of the situation. How is it going to work through the manufacturing line? How does that actually going to scale into a manufacturing environment, into a manufacturing plant? And once it's been made and packed and shipped and consumers have taken that moment of truth, they've picked the product off the shelf, they've tried it, they go, wow, that's great, fabulous stuff, great. That moment of eating as well. The product needs to perform through assembly, through manufacture, and then through consumption as it melts and transforms in the mouth, and then as we then swallow it. And clearly it needs to be acceptable, not just from a sensory point of view, but it has to be acceptable in terms of how it works and performs within the body all the way through. So it genuinely needs to deliver as it delivers today. And this takes us into, then that's really that second moment of truth. How do you really get inside that and make sure that, yes, you know, the product puts the smile on your face and really delivers the consumer experience that we've all known to love. Because when you get to that, then it unlocks the third moment of truth. Then consumers become endorsers of the brand, they're recommended to their friends, and as we all know, one good story breeds on and feeds on, and others will then take that product, try it, will be reassured by it, and will be encouraged by it. And so that's really key, and that builds that virtuous circle. And so what we did within the 30% less sugar Cadbury dairy milk proposition and product that we've launched on the market and it's doing really well, is we really took our time and worked our way through how we would do this, how we would deliver it, and how it would show up on the shelf and show up in consumers' lives as a choice that people could make, and many people are. They like the product, they enjoy the product, and it's a choice they make to choose that product over another one. And that's worked really well. And so that's how we've moved through to the 30% less sugar Cadbury dairy milk, really respecting all of the product performance that we're looking for, and those moments of truth, because get the moments of truth construct and the product science and the product technology right and the ability to manufacture, that all needs to come together in the right way, at the right time, the right product, at the right price, in the right place in store and in consumers' lives. That's how, from my perspective, reformulation as it stands works. So, thanks very much, and if people have any questions, please.
Thank you, Ian, for such an interesting presentation to round off our spring conference series for 2020. So we're now moving on to the Q&A session today, where we'll try to answer as many of your questions as we can. So Ian, the first question is, what type of product reformulations do you buy and consume?
Thanks, Natasha. Personally, one of my all-time favourites is Pepsi Max. To the extent where I used to be a red can Coke consumer, and Pepsi Max for me works really well. I love the mouthfeel. I love the flavour delivery of it, and physically I switched out of red can Coke into Pepsi Max. It's because the product just works and works for me. So that's probably the main one from my side.
Okay, that's good. You made the change, no going back.
I don't think so. No, I find it cleaner as well, cleaner on the mouth. But yeah, we're all different. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good. So moving on. So you mentioned about the moments of truth. That's a really interesting concept. So how important do you see those in reformulation compared to the actual product, science and technology?
I think fundamentally, if you impose a hierarchy, that they must be more important, because if I do a brilliant piece of science and technology, but I don't deliver against I don't deliver a proposition which consumers are prepared to buy for any number of reasons, then the reformulation doesn't land into the marketplace. So I think in terms of a hierarchy, that commercial bundle and its successful deployment must be the primary the primary achievable, and then the product science and technology that then enables that to happen flows through. So I think whilst you can say it's probably, it's the overriding imperative, clearly if the product science and technology isn't there and you don't meet that second moment of truth, well then the whole thing falls over. So perhaps they're just they're partners. Maybe that's a better way of describing it.
Yeah, so sounds like a good synergy there. So I was just wondering about packaging, because you said that's quite important for when we meet the product. So what do you think the implications are with the current, not trend, but the movement now towards reducing packaging? How's that going to change things?
I think packaging is a really intriguing question, because I think whilst the pollution aspects in the sense of where plastic packaging ends up, very clearly a challenge and something we all need to sort out. The other side of the house is that the other side of the debate, which I think sometimes gets left behind, is the vital role that plastics play, and why they're so commonly and so widely used, both in terms of mitigating and preventing food waste, because they're very good barrier materials, as well as how the whole bundle comes together. So how do we achieve the sustainability benefits of using plastic, but without the downside that they can bring as well? So I think that's the step forward. Certainly that's the step forward that we as Mondelez see, is really how do we move into the reusability, the recyclability of those materials, so we keep the benefits of them, and we address some of the negatives that are clearly there.
Okay, thank you. And somebody's asked about where you think edible packaging fits in with all this.
I think edible packaging is a kind of interesting question, because would we want to have packaging that I would take something off the shelf, may have been handled by other people, and then immediately consume it? It's an interesting discussion, isn't it? If I think about, I think for many people at the moment that would probably be a little bit of a no-no. So I think that's a challenging area. I think certainly from a point of view of primary packaging or secondaries, where the consumer's engaging with it. I think in terms of new materials, I am intrigued to see what starts to emerge in terms of new new materials that are coming out that can be recycled, that will fit into the existing recycling streams. I'm not too sure about consumer-facing packaging, which is also edible. I think that's probably for me a step too far. But hey, let's wait and see when it shows up in store and everyone proves me wrong and it's a massive hit, you know. So.
Yeah, certainly to think about the hygiene implications that's brought to a head with the current pandemic, hasn't it? Yeah, about how we behave in stores and so on. Great. Okay, so chocolate, front of a lot of people's minds, I think, now in the lockdown, generally tending towards a lot of treat foods such as that. So there's a question around whether there's the opportunity or the inclination to add better ingredients, say, so prebiotic dietary fiber. Think about a gut healthy chocolate bar. Would that ever come into play, do you think?
I think it's, well, bearing in mind that we use the soluble fiber on the chocolate one, I think it can do. But I think this is where you have to go back to what's the fundamental proposition. I think for most people, a chocolate bar is a moment of indulgence. It may be a me moment. It may be a shared moment. It may be a moment to bring family and friends together for fun. I think to have a chocolate bar that was very specifically focused on gut health would require a slightly different positioning, and we'd need to think about so what does that look like? How does it get positioned? What's the brand it sits under, and what role and fit is it? Can it run? Can you do it? I'm sure you absolutely you can. I think when you look at something like cacao or cocoa, there's a lot in there in terms of the natural product chemistries, and so for example the antioxidants, the flavonols, the catechins. There's a lot of materials in there that have a lot of inherent goodness in them. So in terms of the fiber and probiotic, yeah, I think you can. I think it needs to be done carefully, and it needs to land in a way where the consumer looks at it and it works in the right way and it does the right job. So I think that's where the moments of truth framework help understand what it is we need to design for, and then what is it that product needs to deliver in terms of eat and in terms of experience. So yes, but probably needs I'm not sure it would be an easy fit under one of the big mainstream brands immediately.
Okay, that's a good idea. So sort of combining a few questions, thinking about reformulation. The first part is, do consumers expect that to have less taste because it's different? And another question is more, if we have the full fat, full sugar, full salt version, and it's changed, it's reformulated, are we expecting an absolute match to that?
I think for many consumers, and I think the interesting piece in here is that the balance. Let's put this one again. I think the way this one really works successfully is when people buy the product. So if I make a reformulation change to a standard product, and I impact the flavor delivery, or I impact the texture in a way that's perceived to be negative, then I think you should expect to see consumers saying, well, I like that product less, I like this product a bit more, and switching out of the reformulation into an alternative product. So I think this is one of the dilemmas with reformulation, that if you can't get to technical match, then do you do it? Because ultimately, certainly in a market economy, the consumer chooses. And so inadvertently, there's a bit of a danger in here. If you get it wrong, what you can actually do in some instances is move people from a product which had a better nutritional set, and then you try and move that product further in terms of reducing to a different nutritional composition. You may actually inadvertently encourage, in a way, or discourage people from choosing that product, and they may then choose to move to a product which potentially may have nutritionals which are worse in the first place than the existing product. So I'm not sure that you can, I'm not sure that consumers are prepared for everyone, and certainly at a gen pop level, a general population level, to start making those deliberate choices. I think they can when there's a big degree of question about it, but I think many, well, certainly from what I've seen, and many times they choose not to, and so the choice they make is for flavour and taste in many cases, rather than nutritional change.
So I guess they're accepting the new product in its own right and not necessarily have preconceptions about what they're going to get out of it and how it's going to taste.
Yeah, and that's why I think in some regards this kind of bringing consumers a choice and adding a choice to the repertoire, it can be a better way of making the change and bringing the choice in front of consumers, and then let consumers drive that change through and bring it to life through their consumption, rather than trying to mandate, rather than trying to change forcibly. I think that is true. I think that's how it works best.
Great, okay. So there's an interesting question here about drinks, and they're saying, do consumers get used to less sugary drinks as we continue to remove sugar from them?
I think let's extend this to sugar and salt. I think one of the challenges in this space, one of the opportunities is that over time, by making changes to the products we consume, you can change people's palates and people's taste expectations. So do I think that the sugar piece may change? It may do, but I'm not clear on beverages to what extent the overall sweetness perception has changed versus the sweetness perception linked to sugar. So I think that's one thing to be slightly cautious of. I have heard, I think there was some work done by Leatherhead some time ago, which talked about sodium and looking at salt levels in products and going back into, for example, the 1970s, so circa kind of 50 years ago, and many products had much higher salt levels. And if you recreate those products and put them against their modern equivalent, then for many people there is ooh, crikey, that's too salty. So I think people's tastes do evolve and do change, and they can, it can work. So I think yes, I think there will be an evolution, but I'd be careful with, if I'm swapping out sugar for an intense sweetener, that perception of sweetness, I think I'd be cautious about just assuming that was linked to sugar content.
Mm-hmm. So you're going to get other flavor notes and so on.
Yeah, I think yes, and I'm not a deep expert on the perception of sweetness in beverages and sweetened beverages, but I think if I was to run a QDA panel, I would expect it to be one of the attributes that was scoring. And I think you just need to be looking at the whole sensory profile of the product to begin to understand whether those changes are opening up that opportunity set for a standard product, versus if you then look at alternative products where people bring a new product out into the market, then I think you can kind of, because you're bringing a new proposition and you're talking about the benefits associated with that bundle, you're queuing the benefits, and you're playing with the formulation, you've got the space with flavors, with textures, then I think you can, so in a sense it's almost easier to start from where you want to be rather than starting from where you were.
Okay. So with sugary drinks, if you take the sugar down, you're likely to get a calorie reduction or no cal, low cal. But with more treat foods, chocolate and that sort of thing, once you take the sugar down, the calories necessarily go down in proportion. So where do you think, and how do you think that's going to sit with consumers, whether it's going to mislead them from a healthy proposition, or how would we be able to deliver reduced sugar and reduce calories?
I think it is a fundamental question, because obviously sugar is a carbohydrate. Carbohydrates score out at 4 kilocalories per gram. So if I take out sugar, that's fine. In the form of a beverage, I can add, as I mentioned, I can add water, which is calorifically neutral. In a solid food structure, I have to be able to add something back. So clearly adding fat back isn't a great idea, because that's closer to 9. So that would lift the calorific density of the product. So if I'm working in the carbohydrate space, then I have to get into use of fibers. Then I have to start looking at materials which are partially digestible, so that I've got a lower calorific density of the ingredient I'm including. So I think it is a complicated space, and I hope as time goes by and we see more understanding of the microbiome and the digestion and how to assess that space and understand it better, that we'll be able to communicate more effectively into that space. I think calories in this context and the way in which we currently declare them, I think is quite a blunt tool.
Okay. So here at IFST, we're really trying to encourage new talent into the food sector. So this is an interesting question. Hope you don't mind me asking. Is what training and specialities background do you think the right person to work in reformulation would need?
In a way, actually, the thing I think is really important for reformulation is you've got to love the product. So for me, the most important thing in terms of a skill set is to really understand and have a passion for the product, how it's made, how it's produced, why it's made in that way, and really get under the skin of how a given product is produced, what's the order of addition of the ingredients, why, and something like chocolate, which has been around for well over 100 years, what does that look like, and how has that journey been, and how does that inform the products as we know them today? And then to your point, in terms of the technical aspects that then sit underneath that, well, clearly you've got to understand how the different processes interact with the ingredients, how the ingredients interact with the processes, because those two things are synergistic. We don't deal with inert ingredients in the food system, and the process itself fundamentally causes some of those ingredients and the interactions between them to change. So you've got to be able to understand the chemistries, you've got to be able to understand the physics of what's going on, and that takes you in and opens up a whole wealth of different spaces. So I think it's very difficult to be able to say, oh, you need to be a physical scientist, or you need to be a material scientist, or you need to be a chemical engineer, or you need to be a food chemist. I think it's, in the first instance, it's about having the mindset and the skills that enable you to look at the situation, look at a product, ask yourself what needs to happen, look at it from across the table from the consumer's point of view to really understand how is this going to land with consumers, and then have the open mind to and the willingness to go and ask people to understand, to build knowledge, to then understand how it is you're going to be reproducing that product, reformulating it at a full scale of the product, and then down through the respective length scales as well, all the way down to how it performs at the chemical basis. So I think it goes right across the piece, but if I had to choose, I would choose passion and openness to learning.
Great advice. Thank you for that. So we're in the midst of a pandemic, and people are asking how the current situation is going to affect reformulation plans.
I think in many ways, I think reformulation plans will continue. I think the pandemic and the impact of it, from my perspective, is that it accelerates trends. Changes of this sort of nature, I think, don't necessarily create a change of their own making. We may see some changes within the world, but I think many things that have already been going on will be accelerated by the pandemic. So the drive for reformulation, the interest in it, and many of the consumer trends that perhaps sit behind that, I think will continue. And so I would expect to see reformulation very much on the agenda, and to see companies, and I would almost be expecting companies to continue to look at the space, to be asking themselves questions, and to be seeing what fits best and works best for consumers.
Great, okay. So we've talked a lot about sugar, calories, and so forth. On the fat side of things, what do you think the opportunities are to change fats or reduce fats? So palm oil obviously comes to mind in lots of people's questions.
I think fats is always an interesting space. I think one of the dilemmas we see is classically you'd take fat out and you'd replace it with a hydrocolloid. Yeah, you can do that. And I think this is where we need some of the microbiome data. I think in time will be helpful in terms of actually informing how that works, and making sure that we're clear on the benefits of using hydrocolloids versus the benefits of using fats. Which fats are we looking for? Because we know that fat is not a fat. Yeah, so there's very nice work funded by the BBSRC some years ago that really uncovered that dairy fats are digested in a very different way. Dairy systems are digested in a very different way to other fats. So I think that's an interesting piece. I think if we look at palm, I think palm is a complicated space. I don't think it's one we can shy away from. And certainly from a Mondelez perspective, we work with RSPO palm and with our suppliers, because we look at how do we get the supply chain in the right shape and working and acting and driving responsibly. And that's all public knowledge, that's public domain, that's on the websites. And I think one of the reasons why, certainly from my side, I'm so convinced by that is if I do look for plant-based sources of oils, the plant which is the most efficient plant at producing oil is the oil palm. So the plant's doing its best job. The challenge with it is making sure that the plant is grown and used in the right way, in the right environment, and in the right context, and that people and farmers, producers are really building in a sustainable approach to the delivery of that oil and to growing that crop, because it's such an efficient crop. If you physically just stop using it, then what we'll then start to see happening is, the sheer volumes of things like oilseed rape and other plants that will need to get grown to backfill that volume is much greater, and so it is a complicated space, and that's why, from my point of view, I think getting to RSPO, so responsibly sustainably sourced palm oil, is such an important step as we work through, okay, so do we rebalance some of the fat systems? Do we look to alternative solutions? And how do we really make the whole system work with all the attributes that you need for sustainability?
Okay, big topic. Well done for condensing that down.
It is, but I think that's one of the things with food at the moment is I think we are on the cusp of moving into a very much a food system led approach. And I know the guys at Oxford with IFST and other and that network, the work they've put together there is we really need to reconceptualize how we see food from where it was originally, in a sense, which has enabled the drive through scale, through cost efficiencies, which has really ensured that food has become affordable for many more people than it was. And now, as we now begin to see the full biology of our global system, and we need to understand how our food system operates and the roles and how it flows. So when you make an ingredient choice, how does that cascade back through the system? What are the consequences? What are the unintended consequences? So I think that systemic way of looking at food, which is a globally connected supply, is so important, because everything that we do starts in a field, starts in an orchard, starts in the sea. And we have to make sure that we preserve and enrich that cycle and that entire system.
Okay, thank you. So cost obviously comes to mind on a lot of these things, and one of the question is, how would you consider, or how would you address the needs of price sensitive consumers?
I think cost is always one of the issues, because many of these materials that we're looking to reformulate in some ways are commodity ingredients, and so when we replace them with something which is more functional, or usually we're looking at a cost which is at least equivalent, usually higher, and that brings a challenge, because as an industry we don't run on high margins, so it's a difficult space. So I think the challenges are, how do you make portion size work for you? How can you get the products delivered? How can you get the right choices available? And I suppose the question mark comes is, which markets are we looking at in? Are we looking at just in a Western or in developed market context? Are we thinking about that more in a developing and emerging context? Because the answers may well be different in terms of satisfying the product moment and the product experience for consumers may lead to a different answer beyond a simple replication or reformulation of an existing product. So I think it's long story short, it can be expensive, it can be difficult. You need to make the right choices and see if there are alternative solutions that get you to the same consumer experience, rather than necessarily a like for like technical match reformulation, which can be difficult from a cost point of view.
Yeah, okay. So looking ahead to future trends, speculation, and what you think the key areas will be, chocolate and wider. What do you think? It's difficult to say, I guess, but where do you think that the movement will be?
I think where the media is focused, or has been focused for a while now, is on sugar. I mean, I do find it slightly frustrating. We seem to kind of go through cycles of demonizing ingredients, which I'm not sure that demonizing single ingredients is an effective strategy. Where do I think we'll go? I think the kitchen cupboard ingredients line, as I see it, so simple, recognizable ingredients. I think that's a trend that's been with us for a while, and I think that will stay. I think that will continue. Specifically, maybe COVID-19 accelerates that potentially. I think the sustainability agenda will continue to grow, and I think that's important. I think we'll continue to see that build out. What I suspect we may also begin to see, potentially, because one of the impacts here economically of this is that we may well move into much more straightened economic times, is that we may see less choice. And I think we've been seeing that in some way, shape, or form. Certainly if I look at from the UK where I live, where a number of the heavy discounter supermarkets, part of their proposition is that, you know, if you want that particular product, there's one on the shelf, max 2, but not loads. And so I think we may see a continuation of that if people need to go and find lower cost solutions, or we go back into the kind of the value territory that I remember growing up as a child, then that I think may also be perhaps slightly unexpected for some people, that we may see less choice. But I think those are the main ones. Yeah, I think that possible. So, and I think we shouldn't forget that coming out of this pandemic, which we will, we need to face into the economic realities of where we're operating. That we shouldn't be thinking, oh, it's all going to be just the same, carry on. There will be, I'm sure there will be change, and how that change flows through is ultimately, we need to understand how that lands and impacts with consumers, because, as I mentioned all the way through the talk, it's about giving those consumers the choice and enabling them to make those choices.
Yeah, that's a good point. So part of the meeting the product for the first time, or meeting it when we go out to shop, is the messaging on packs. There's a question about whether you would like to see changes in the health claims regulations so that food producers can advertise reduced fat, salt, sugar, etc.
Regulation really isn't my space, and I don't pretend to understand it, so I'm going to duck the question. But I noticed something else someone was talking about, so if you don't mind, I'm going to use the kind of the artwork conversation and we'll talk about it in a slightly different way, which is, I think, one of the things which is a challenge. It needs to be really clear if you're going to call out on pack that there's less of something in there, because many times if we talk about less, for many consumers that triggers the less is less taste, and so I think you have to use it very carefully. And I know there's been quite a lot of reformulation work done in many cases where it's not called out on the front of pack, because the main reason that people are buying that product is either for its taste or for what it's doing for them. But in that instance, the less of a given ingredient may not actually be a part of the benefit set or part of the needs that they're looking for. So by bringing that into the on-pack communication, you can in many ways weaken the proposition. Now, clearly that's not what we did with 30% less sugar on CDM. That addresses a very specific need, and that's why it calls it out. But I think certainly from my side, I'm very cautious about doing that unless there is a really clear consumer pull for it to be there. Otherwise, yes, I do think, as some of you pointed out on the questions, you can trigger that sense of, oh, less. Because it's not common that many of us go shopping to buy less of something.
Except when the price comes down. Yes, a negative connotation.
Well, yeah, exactly. Less of the prices. I do like a bargain as much as the next person. So I'm with you on that one, Natasha.
Okay, no problem. Okay. So we're getting close on time here, but I just wanted to bring this one to your attention in case you hadn't spotted it. So it's about global brands, global products, or countries taking different recipes and that sort of thing. So it's the same product tailored or fine-tuned depending on the culture where it's going to be sold. So they're specifically talking about higher salt or sweeter diet preferences. I was thinking more about the environmental conditions and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, so I think, how to answer the question? I think in the first instance, you've got to start with the consumer, because if they're not going to buy the product, then clearly you've got a problem, because the launch is going to struggle. So yes, you would expect to see tailoring. And I think for many of the global brands, if you try the products in different countries, you will see and taste a difference. And now for many of us in our lives, specifically, especially at the moment, that's not really a choice whichever gets put in front of us. We experience a brand, a product, we understand and we know that sensorially from how it shows up for us on the shelf in the products that we buy and eat, and that's what we learn. So in some regards, that is that reality. Do products taste different? Yeah, if you source products from around the world, then you will find different flavors and different tastes. The more nuances, I would describe, rather than fundamental differences, but you will find them. Some brands do choose an alternative route, which is to say, no, this is what it tastes like, this is the taste, and they'll hold into it, and I think that can depend on how distinctive it is and what their proposition is. Because if you can secure that space and that's what you taste like, then that can be highly differentiating and sustaining in the market and be a very important part of your proposition. But if you're going to go down that route, whereby you're going to have to convert potentially a generation of consumers to enjoying your product the way you believe it should be made, not the way they would necessarily like it within their own culinary culture, then you've got to be in for the long haul and you've got to be committed. And that's not just from a technical point of view, that's also from a commercial, a marketing, a sales point of view, because in many cases, in the first instances, those products might turn slowly. So that's, I can understand why, and that's the basis of my understanding of why often we and most companies will make sure that a given product is balanced and optimized for a given market. Do you look at supply constraints as a part of that? Yeah, absolutely. If I'm going to be making a product in a given country, I need to be able to source the ingredients. What's the best way of doing that? What's the most sustainable way of doing that? Local isn't always the most sustainable, but it might be the consumer preferred way. So it is a complicated mix, but at the end of the day, ultimately it comes back to, what does your brand want to be, and what are your consumers, and where do your consumers want you to be? And those are the questions and the tensions that you need to work through.
Great. Okay. So you'd be thinking about shelf life as well. That was one of the questions that came up.
For me, shelf life, yes, I think shelf life, well, from my point of view, as I look at it and the projects that I and my teams work on, that's a non-debate. I don't think that changing the shelf life per se is an option. It's certainly from a point of view of unless you absolutely have to. And if you have to, then you need to be cognizant of what that means, because for many retailers, they'll only accept product or only hold product that has a certain number of a certain amount of time left on the code date. So you've got to plan that one through your supply chain, through your logistics, and also recognize, okay, well, and how's it going to land with the customer? Because that's in many cases the route to market. If the shelf life comes down dramatically, then I think that can be a challenge, because it goes to the commercial potential weakness in the commercial supply model. So a hard one, but the simple answer for me and what we do a lot of the time is, how do I get to the same shelf life? Because that's what the logistic chains, that's what the supply side, that's what the customers, that's what everything is configured for. So designing to deliver the same in many cases is, for me, what it's about. But then if you look at many of the products that we see in the shelves now and we buy them, you'll find written on the back, place in the refrigerator after opening. And so I think it's a valid route. It's something to be considered, but it does need to be worked through in terms of how it lands on shelf and lands with the customers and with the logistic chains.
Great. So they can follow the storage instructions. Great. So time is pressing on. Thank you so much, Ian. I just wondered if there's any other questions that you particularly wanted to address whilst we've got a minute or two.
Yeah, I think there was a question from the guys at Bath Spa around the basic science, and I think when you get into looking at, okay, what do I replace material with, then I think yes, you do have to begin to look back at the materials that we're looking at and understand the interactions between the materials, so the material science, and also the transformational science in terms of what a given unit operation, a given process, and the chemistries and physical changes that are being driven through that process. So I think when you get down to it, you can start at the product length scale, but if you're going to make a really resilient and robust reformulation change, it has to work all the way down to the molecular level. And that has to be through the manufacturing, but then, as you've also just recently talked through as well, also through the whole shelf life and logistics chain of the product. So yes, you do fundamentally, if you really want to get your head around it, you need to understand it end to end, from molecules to shelf.
Great. Okay. Thank you. There is a question about new digital technologies, but I think that's probably a topic for another webinar, don't you? It's quite a big area to discuss that, unless you just had a point on that.
I think it depends on what we mean by digital. I think digital is, I mean, we talk about digitization of the food system, and the role that new sensor technologies, new control methodologies have, or are we talking about the ability to get into 3D printing or into new forms? So I think digitization of the food system per se, be it tracking, be it all down into the manufacturing plant, I think that's a fascinating topic, and really talks to the whole heart of Industry 4.0. So I think that would be a really interesting topic for another webinar.
Okay. May see an invitation coming your way. So thank you so much, Ian, and thank you to everyone from across the globe for attending today's webinar. Finally, we'd like to remind you, for those of you not familiar with IFST, that you could find really useful resources on our website, including the brand new COVID-19 Knowledge Hub. We've also got our online FS&T Food Science and Technology magazine. We welcome new members, so please check our membership benefits page on the IFST website. Thank you and goodbye.